Welcome to Frames of Time. Make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this. A young girl with an enslaved woman. Brazilian Empire, 1880. A British blacksmith removes the manacle from a newly freed slave, 1907. Enslaved workers on J.J. Smith's cotton plantation in South Carolina, 1862. A wealthy passenger being carried in a litera by workers in Bahia, Brazil, late 19th century. United States colored troops, USCT soldiers during the American Civil War, 1860s. The branded hand of Captain Jonathan Walker, an abolitionist punished for aiding enslaved people to freedom, 1844. A Union officer with a young formerly enslaved boy, likely a camp servant or aide during the American Civil War, 1860s. African American prisoners in the convict leasing system, post-Civil War United States, late 19th to early 20th century. An African American man being whipped in a U.S. prison in 1889, highlighting the continued exploitation of black individuals after slavery. Daguerreotype of Renty, an enslaved man in South Carolina, taken in 1850 by Louis Agassiz to support racist pseudoscience. Former slave Willis Wynn holding a horn used to call enslaved people, photographed by Russell Lee near Marshall, Texas, April 1939. An enslaved child in Zanzibar carrying a heavy log as punishment, 1890. Samuel Phillips Verner, center, with Africans he bought from slave traders for the 1904 World's Fair, falsely presented as pygmies. African slaves picking cotton under the supervision of an overseer. An 1838 poster offers a $150 reward for a runaway slave in Bardstown, Kentucky. Prisoners in barred transport wagons rest after forced road labor in Pitt County, North Carolina, 1910. Australian Aboriginal people chained in a prison in Wyndham, Western Australia, 1902. A wealthy woman seated in a litera, sedan chair, carried by enslaved men, Brazil, 19th century. Two formerly enslaved children photographed by Matthew Brady, United States, 1860s. Enslaved Africans crowded aboard a slave ship during the transatlantic slave trade, 19th century. Japanese sex slaves undergoing training for military duties during World War II. Selknam indigenous people taken from Chile to be exhibited in European human zoos, 1889. Slaves working in a coffee yard on a farm in Vale de Paraíba, São Paulo, 1882. Descendants of Irish slaves on a plantation in Barbados. Enslaved indigenous people in the Amazon during the rubber boom, early 20th century. Formerly enslaved women at a reunion in Washington, D.C., 1916. A 107-year-old former slave and his wife listening to a Ku Klux Klan preacher in Talladega, Alabama, 1948. Light-skinned enslaved children in New Orleans, 1863, classified as black under the one-drop rule and photographed to promote freedmen's education. East African enslaved people freed from a dhow by HMS Daphne on November 1, 1868. An Arab slave trader in custody aboard HMS Sphinx, captured off the coast of Mozambique, 1907. Omar ibn Said, an Islamic scholar from Senegal, was enslaved in the United States for over 50 years, early 1860s. An 1880 photograph of sugarcane cutters in Jamaica, descendants of enslaved Africans, taking a break during plantation work. 88-year-old Mrs. Sally Ficklin, a former slave, looking at the Emancipation Proclamation in 1947, signed when she was 3. Formerly enslaved Shores family in Custer County, Nebraska, 1887. Enslaved African and Yucatecan Indian laborers on a Cuban plantation, 1863. Photograph from May 17, 1888, showing a mass celebrating the abolition of slavery in Brazil. Miss Wyoming, 1973, Joyce McKinney, arrested in 1977 for kidnapping Mormon missionary Kirk Anderson and forcing him to be her sex slave. Black Union soldiers who escaped slavery and joined the fight for freedom, American Civil War, 1860s. Contraband slaves at the Allen Farm, Yorktown, Virginia, seeking refuge in Union territory during the Civil War, 1862. An African-American family spanning 4 generations, all born on J.J. Smith's plantation in Beaufort, South Carolina. Coolies sorting tobacco leaves under Dutch supervision in an Indonesian warehouse, 1897. Sharecroppers picking cotton in Georgia, 1898. A black boy sits in a cage while 2 white girls play around him, Belgian Congo, 1955. East African enslaved people rescued by the British naval ship HMS Daphne on November 1, 1868. A group of African Americans aboard the USS Vermont. The United States Navy employed thousands of freed slaves during the Civil War. An elderly, weary black woman carrying a grown white man on her back. Second Lieutenant John Wallace Comer with Burrell, his enslaved servant, Company H, 57th Alabama Infantry. Photograph depicting the blackbirding of indigenous South Pacific Islanders, circa 1890. A missionary symbolizing the Belgian civilizing mission being transported by Congolese people. Wilson Chin, a branded slave from Louisiana, wearing an iron collar, a torture device that restricted movement and prevented escape. Joseph Carpenter, an abolitionist dedicated to fighting slavery, poses with a young enslaved girl. An auction house on Whitehall Street, Atlanta, Georgia, 1864, where enslaved individuals were sold. Lewis Martin, a member of the United States Colored Troops, photographed after losing his arm in the Civil War. Black woman carrying a white child on her back, Bahia, 1860. Slaves heading to the coffee harvest with an ox cart, Vale do Paraíba, São Paulo, 1885. Formerly enslaved people outside of Freedman's Village in Arlington, Virginia, 1860s. Ex-slave and his wife who live in a decaying plantation house, Greene County, Georgia. A group of people who escaped slavery during the Civil War on the former plantation of Thomas Drayton, a Confederate general. Enslaved African Americans on a South Carolina plantation, 1860. Plantation slaves gathered outside their huts, Virginia, circa 1860. Formerly enslaved people, contraband, sit at Fuller's house in Cumberland Landing, Virginia, circa 1850. Abolitionist leader Harriet Tubman, far left, with family and formerly enslaved people she helped escape, circa 1887. A woman, possibly portraying a slave, sits churning butter in a replica colonial-era kitchen, mid-20th century. Lieutenant Washington, a Confederate prisoner, and Captain Custer, 1862. Freed slaves picking peanuts in Virginia, circa late 1890s. Children of enslaved people sit outside their quarters on a South Carolina plantation, 1860. Two black slaves use a primitive plow for rice farming on a plantation in Savannah, Georgia, circa 1850. A rare Spanish document detailing the importation of slaves to the Americas, displayed at the Schomburg Center, New York Public Library, circa 1955. A woman born into slavery, photographed in Greensboro, Alabama, 1941. Enslaved men in chains, guarded by a native Askari soldier, circa 1896. Three Abyssinian slaves in iron collars and chains, circa 1910. A wealthy Abyssinian landowner rides a mule, preparing for a journey with the people he enslaved, circa 1910. Two enslaved boys, circa 1870. Free African American family post-Civil War, circa 1898. Freed African Americans in a southern town after the U.S. Civil War, circa 1870.